Welcome. We're at Studio 21, Tulsa Community College, talking about our Civil War commemoration series. And with us today, we have Dr. Stephen Woodworth from Texas Christian University, who has written, according to my count, about 15 books, and he's got a new one coming out, which I hope we can talk about in just a few minutes. But the first thing I'd like to ask Dr. Woodworth, he's a historian interested in history. How'd you get interested in the Civil War?
Well, it came about much the way I got interested in history. My father was always interested in history, just in an amateur sort of way. He wasn't a professional historian, but he liked to read history books. I used to bug him to read to me when I was little, before I could read. And so he read to me, and some of the things he read to me were Bruce Catton, and that got me interested in the Civil War, and it kind of caught, and I never got over it.
Well, there's a lot of people that, in fact, I guess the Civil War is probably the largest area for people to read books, get involved in, write books, things like that. So it's a good area to be in. Mm-hmm. One of the interesting questions that's come up recently in history is the question of secession and is it inevitable? And there's a number of books that have been written on the crisis at Fort Sumter, et cetera, et cetera. What's your take on that? Could secession have been postponed or actually nipped in the bud? Or, as some historians have claimed, it was in the cards as soon as Lincoln got elected?
Well, I'm not comfortable with the concept of inevitability. I always think, it could change if people would make different choices. Once Lincoln was elected, the different choices that would have had to have been made would have been that white Southerners would have had to accept that they had lost this election, but that another election was coming up in 4 years. Maybe they could change the outcome there. They had controlled the federal government, white Southerners, had controlled the federal government, or had a considerable degree of control of it, though, for most of the history of the country. And they just weren't prepared to accept not being in control of the country. But for secession to be avoided, they would have had to have taken more of a long-term approach and said, look, there's another election in 4 years. We've got another chance.
It didn't seem they were so inclined.
No.
One of the big battles that occurred in 1861, in fact, the first large battle, was the Battle of Bull Run, or Manassas, and the South won by a hair. If they had actually lost that battle, some historians have contended that that probably would have demoralized the South and the Civil War would have been much shorter. What's your take on that?
Well, it's always hard to say what would have happened, so we're making a guess. I'll make mine. My guess is that it wouldn't have demoralized them that much. Some, obviously, losing the battle demoralized the North, clearly. And it wouldn't have done the South any good to lose it.
But yeah, the North recovered their morale, right, so you
exactly.
could argue that the South would have too.
They buckled down, they recognized it's going to be a hard war, we're going to have to do a lot better than we've done, we're going to have to bring a lot more of an effort. I think the Southern response would have been much the same. I think it was going to take an awful lot to convince either side to give up.
That probably would have. This is our logo for this year. It's Lincoln and Jefferson Davis, and next year our logo is going to be a picture of the Monitor and the Merrimack, the famous ironclads that clashed in 1862, but those weren't the first ironclads, were they?
Well, not quite the first. The British and French had been experimenting with this. I mean, if you go back to the Crimean War in 1854 to 56, the French had experimented with barges, almost like the Virginia or Merrimack, that were ironclad, and there were floating batteries. Then, later in the 1850s, the French had taken what was basically a ship of the line and had plated it with iron, the French La Grau, and that was the first ironclad seagoing warship. The British answered back with a much more advanced vessel, a sort of a super frigate, a very long ship with a completely iron frame, iron plate, very powerful, most powerful ship afloat, HMS Warrior. So ironclads were an idea that were beginning to come to naval warfare at that time.
And they actually came on the Mississippi.
That's right. That's right. The Union was working on some gunboats. They saw their combat debut approximately 1 month before the Monitor and Merrimack. Monitor and Merrimack fight for the first time in early March of 62. In early February of 62, what are called the Eads ironclads, built by a gentleman named Eads, they saw their combat debut at the Battle of Fort Henry. and did quite well.
And one can still see the famous Eads Bridge in St. Louis
Yes.
that he had constructed shortly after the Civil War. One of the controversies that is probably heated up in the last 10 or so years is the importance of the West in the Civil War. Before that, most of the focus was on the Army of the Potomac. Almost all the movies that would be made were about the Army of the Potomac. These were the generals, both Union and Confederate, that were the best recognized. But in the last few years, there's been a movement to recognize that the contributions in the West, and that would be Ohio, Alabama, not California,
Right.
were extremely important and possibly decisive. You have written on this. What's your take on?
Right. Well, as you say, the concept West can be confusing to modern ears because we think, well, New Mexico, California. And when we talk about the West in the Civil War, we simply mean west of Virginia. So between the Appalachians and the Mississippi. And yes, absolutely, that's where the war was decided. It was an area big enough that the Union superiority in numbers could tell there. They could actually use their superiority in numbers in the West. Versus Virginia, it's very narrow. Not that you can line up troops across the Virginia front, but it's narrow enough that Lee has a pretty good chance of blocking what the Union tries to do. Second, in the West, the rivers are deep enough for those gunboats, and even more important, for the unarmed transport vessels that are going to carry troops, and still more important, supplies, because supplies are very decisive to what an army can do. And in the West, between the Appalachians and the Mississippi, those supplies can move on rivers. Now, if you're moving your supplies on a railroad, the enemy cavalry can get behind you, tear up your railroad, mess with it. They can't do that to a river. It just stays there. So that was key in the West. In the East, the rivers flow the wrong way. They're too shallow, really, to be used for that kind of access in the key areas, and they flow the wrong direction. So every river in Virginia is a barrier to Union advance. In the West, many times, those rivers flow on an axis that allows Union troops to advance along them. And that's a big advantage. And then, finally, you could call it the luck of the draw, you could call it Providence or what you will, but the best Union generals just happened to start out the war in the West. And in the East, less so. That's where the good Confederate generals were.
Speaking of generals, you've written several books on the Confederate command structure in the West, and one of the most interesting generals, Confederate generals, I find is Braxton Bragg, who is almost universally condemned. But you have a different take on that.
That's right. I think, I'm not going to argue that Bragg was another Robert E. Lee or Stonewall Jackson. Clearly he wasn't. But neither was he the just, fool, utter fool and blunderer that a lot of accounts paint him to be. And there are various reasons for this. During the war, he got a bad press. Bragg had a serious weakness as a general, and that was he was not very good at leadership. Tactics, strategy, training, logistics, a lot of things that generals have to do, Bragg was good at. But the leadership thing, that is motivating people to follow him, motivating his subordinate generals to work with him, was not his strong point. He clearly tried, and he wasn't always very successful. And he had a very hard task with the generals that he got put under him. They were difficult people. At one point, Jefferson Davis suggested to Robert E. Lee, why don't you go out and take the command of the Western armies? And Lee didn't want to do that. He wrote back various reasons why that wouldn't be a good idea. But the top of his list of reasons why I, Robert E. Lee, should not go and take command of the Western armies, I don't think I could get cooperation out of those generals. If Lee couldn't do it, Bragg was really stuck doing it.
I think you're right, from what I know. And speaking of Jefferson Davis, you're going to be speaking on him tonight in the secession crisis. It has been said that he has been way too loyal to his generals and didn't really see their faults. He, of course, was a graduate of West Point, and he was loyal to his West Point friends who became generals. Lincoln, on the other hand, had no military training other than what he himself acquired as the war progressed, and it's been claimed that Lincoln was much better able to see objectively whether generals were performing or not, whereas Jefferson Davis would stubbornly hold on to a person he's picked. What's your comments on that?
I don't think it was Davis's West Point education that handicapped him in that sense. I think that what Lincoln had going for him was that he was simply a man of exceptional intellect. Almost, I mean, what we call today a freak or a fluke of nature. The man simply had a tremendous brain. And I think that enabled him, with a little work, and he had to catch up, and he was sending over to the Library of Congress for books to read on military science. And he educated himself and became quite good. Not that he didn't make mistakes, and I think sometimes, you know, he was successful, he won, and so we tend to overlook his mistakes, but there were some. Davis, on the other hand, I think it's not a matter of loyalty or not seeing generals' faults. Davis tended to come to the war at the beginning with an opinion about a general. For example, Joseph Johnston. He's a good and skillful general. He'll be good in command, so I'll just keep putting him in command. And even after Davis had been very disappointed with him and frankly had terrible squabbles with him, he continues to think, Johnston is a great general if we could only get him somehow to use his skills. In fact, it turned out that although Johnston was intelligent, Johnston had skills, he was unfitted by temperament to be a general in command of an army. And Davis just didn't seem to accept this. He had made up his mind about Johnston a long time ago, and he wasn't going to learn anything new about him. And Lincoln, on the other hand, I think as a man of truly superior intellect, could recognize he could always learn something new. He was always learning new things and always ready to be wiser today than he was last year, and to admit, therefore, that he had been wrong in the past.
Speaking of Generals Johnston, there was Albert Sidney Johnston, the first overall commander of the western part of the Confederacy, and he has been criticized for spreading his forces too thin and eventually having to yield originally almost all of Tennessee, and then finally trying to recoup at the Battle of Shiloh, he lost his life. What's your take on Albert Sidney Johnston?
Johnston, as you say, died awfully early in the war, his first major battle. And so it's hard to say about him. You know, it's been mentioned that if Robert E. Lee had died at the Battle of Mechanicsville, which was the first of the 7 days battles, it was Lee's first big offensive, a couple of months after Johnston's death, 3 months. If Lee had died there, we would think that Lee was a pretty mediocre general. We would not be very impressed with him. Similarly with Johnston, and with Johnston, it's the actual case. With Lee, had he died at Mechanicsville, it would be the case. We would be left kind of speculating, how good was he really? I think Johnston had some things going for him. He was highly regarded in the old army. He had a great reputation. He was an intelligent man. He definitely had Albert Sidney Johnston had exactly those traits that Joseph E. Johnston lacked. He had the temperament, the determination, the willingness to take responsibility, the willingness to take risks, something that Lee also had, Joseph Johnston didn't. Now, Albert Sidney Johnston, as you said, spread his forces rather thin at the beginning. You know, I think it's interesting. People who started the war in top command usually wind up getting somewhat discredited, whether it was Winfield Scott or George B. McClellan on the Union side, Johnston on the Confederate side. Usually, it's just hard to look good in those early months. Grant starts out in a lower position, does very well, actually shows up Albert Sidney Johnston. He's the guy that basically unravels, or you could say he pulls the string that unravels Johnston's whole front. But Grant himself said that it was easier to start out where he did, in a relatively low position, kind of a second level position, versus starting out in a top position. And I think that was part of the problem. And I think the question for Albert Sidney Johnston was how well could he recover? You know, after being shown up, after getting the worst of that first encounter, how well could he recover? And he tries at Shiloh, and he dies in the middle of it. So we're left with no real answer to that. He might have been quite a good general, but we can't really prove that for sure.